Imagine walking through the skeletal remains of America's retail empire. Over 700 abandoned Walmart supercenters scattered across the country like graveyards of consumer dreams. These aren't just empty buildings. They're monuments to something far more sinister than corporate failure. What happens when a place designed to never close, never rest, never stop the endless cycle of buying and selling, suddenly goes silent? The fluorescent lights may be dark, but something else has taken residence in these hollow temples of commerce. Tonight, you'll hear 7 true encounters from people who discovered that some Walmarts never really close. They just change what they're selling, and what they're buying might be more than you're willing to pay. These aren't urban legends or internet creepypasta. These are real testimonies from real people who learned that death doesn't always mean the end of the night shift. Before we begin this journey into America's most haunted retail spaces, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because once you hear these stories, you'll want to stay connected to others who know the truth about what lurks in our abandoned shopping centers. What you're about to hear will make you question every empty storefront you pass, every darkened parking lot you walk through, and every automatic door that opens just a little too slowly. Welcome to the real horror of retail hell. Story 1. Marcus had cleaned plenty of abandoned buildings before, but something felt different about the Walmart in Carthage, Texas the moment he stepped through the employee entrance at 11 p.m. The store had been closed for only 3 months, yet the air carried that particular staleness of a place forgotten by time, thick with dust and the lingering ghost of artificial vanilla air freshener that corporate headquarters mandated for every location. His contract was simple: final deep clean before the building went to auction, remove any remaining debris, and document damages for insurance purposes. What Marcus didn't expect was for the motion sensor lights to still be functioning, flickering to life in perfect retail formation as he walked the main aisle with his equipment cart. The fluorescents hummed that familiar tune every night shift worker knew, but here in the empty cavern of retail space, it sounded more like a funeral dirge than the soundtrack of commerce. He started in the electronics section, sweeping up scattered plastic security tags and wiping down empty display cases that still bore the ghostly outlines of televisions and gaming consoles. That's when he heard the first shopping cart rolling somewhere in the distance, a rhythmic squeak, squeak, squeak moving through what sounded like the grocery section. Marcus called out, thinking maybe another cleaner had been hired without his knowledge, but his voice just echoed back through the hollow aisles, distorted by the acoustics of empty shelving units. The squeaking stopped. He continued working, telling himself it was probably just settling sounds from the building's HVAC system, though he noticed the temperature felt oddly regulated for an abandoned building. By 1 a.m., he'd cleared most of the front section when the PA system crackled to life with that distinctive Walmart chime, followed by a voice he'd never heard before. "Attention, Walmart shoppers, the store will be closing in 30 minutes. Please bring your final selections to the front registers." The announcement echoed through the empty store with crystal clarity, as if the sound system had been waiting 3 months to deliver this final message. Marcus felt his skin crawl as he realized someone, or something, had just announced closing time in a store that had been closed for months. He grabbed his radio to call his supervisor but got only static. His cell phone showed no signal, which was impossible since he'd been texting his wife just an hour earlier. The lights began shutting off section by section, starting from the back of the store and moving toward him in a systematic pattern that followed the exact protocol Walmart used every night at closing time. Marcus had never worked retail, but something deep in his bones recognized this ritual, as if the building itself was following a script that had been performed thousands of times before. He packed his equipment quickly, but as he wheeled his cart toward the exit, he heard them. Multiple shopping carts now, rolling through different aisles, creating a symphony of squeaks and rattles that seemed to follow predetermined paths through the store. The automatic doors at the front entrance remained stubbornly closed, their sensors dead despite the power clearly running somewhere in the building. Marcus tried the employee exit, his keycard beeping against the scanner, but the door remained locked. The PA system crackled again. "Attention, associates. Please report to your designated closing stations for final inventory count." The voice was different this time. Younger, female, with the practiced cheerfulness of someone who had made this announcement countless times. Marcus's heart hammered as he realized he wasn't just trapped in an abandoned building. He was trapped in a store that was still operating on some level beyond physical reality. The shopping carts were converging now, their squeaking growing louder and more coordinated, heading toward the front registers where checkout lanes sat empty but somehow expectant. He could hear the electronic beeps of barcode scanners processing invisible purchases, the mechanical voices of self-checkout machines guiding customers through transactions that couldn't possibly be happening. "Please place the item in the bagging area," came the automated voice, followed by the rustle of plastic bags being filled with nothing. Marcus ran through the aisles, his footsteps echoing like gunshots, but every exit he tried remained sealed. The lights continued their systematic shutdown until only the emergency lighting remained, casting everything in that sickly green glow that made the empty shelves look like the ribs of some enormous beast. That's when he saw them. Shadows moving through the aisles with purpose, pushing carts filled with shapes he couldn't quite focus on, their movements following the familiar choreography of late-night shoppers hunting for deals. The shadows congregated at the registers, forming orderly lines that stretched back into the darkness, waiting patiently for checkout clerks who would never come. Or maybe they were already there, invisible hands scanning invisible products, the registers chiming with each sale in a symphony of commerce that death couldn't stop. Marcus found himself walking toward customer service, drawn by some instinct he didn't understand, and there behind the counter stood a figure in a blue vest with a name tag that read, "Always here to help." The figure looked up at him with eyes that reflected the emergency lighting like pools of stagnant water and smiled the practiced smile of customer service perfection. "Can I help you find something tonight?" the figure asked, and Marcus realized with growing horror that his answer would determine whether he ever left this store or joined the ranks of eternal employees, forever serving customers who had been shopping here long after the living world had moved on. The last thing Marcus remembered clearly was nodding yes, accepting that name tag that materialized in the figure's outstretched hand, feeling the familiar weight of retail responsibility settling on his shoulders like a uniform he'd worn his entire life. Because some stores never really close, they just change their hiring practices, and the benefits package includes eternity. Story 2. Elena Rodriguez had been documenting dead malls and abandoned retail spaces for her YouTube channel, Forgotten America, for 3 years, but the Walmart in Zanesville, Ohio was supposed to be her easiest shoot yet. The supercenter had been closed since 2017, after the company cited underperformance and changing market conditions, which was corporate speak for a town that had slowly bled residents to bigger cities. She'd gotten permission from the property management company to film inside, though they'd warned her the electricity had been shut off years ago and to bring her own lighting equipment. What they didn't mention was that some of the lights were still on. Elena pushed through the main entrance at 2 p.m. on a gray Tuesday afternoon, her camera gear slung over her shoulder and her phone already recording her initial impressions. The automatic doors had been disabled, but they stood propped open with chunks of concrete, letting in weak autumn sunlight that illuminated dust motes dancing in the stale air like microscopic ghosts. She'd expected the typical abandonment scene. Empty shelves, scattered debris, maybe some graffiti from local kids, but instead found herself staring at shelves that weren't completely empty. Products sat in organized rows, though nothing she recognized from modern retail. Generic boxes with faded labels in languages she couldn't identify, canned goods with expiration dates from decades past, and shopping carts positioned throughout the store as if customers had simply vanished mid-purchase. The strangest part was the soft, fluorescent humming coming from somewhere deeper in the store, accompanied by that gentle background music that every retail space played. instrumental versions of songs from the 1980s that seemed to loop endlessly. Elena started filming, narrating her observations as she walked the main aisle, but her voice sounded different in the space, echoing with a hollow quality that her equipment shouldn't have been picking up. The pharmacy section still had its white coat hanging behind the counter, and the photo center displayed pictures in its windows, family portraits and wedding shots from people she'd never seen, their faces smiling with the slightly overexposed quality of film photography from 30 years ago. She tried to check the timestamp on the photos, but the dates seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, changing from 1987 to 1995 to 2003 and back again. The electronics section buzzed with activity despite the supposed power outage. Television screens displayed static that occasionally resolved into fragments of old commercials. VCRs clicked and whirred as they rewound invisible tapes, and boomboxes played songs she remembered from her childhood but couldn't quite name. Elena filmed everything, but when she checked her camera's playback, the footage showed empty shelves and dead screens, as if her equipment was recording a different version of reality than what her eyes were seeing. That's when she heard the first customer. A woman's voice drifted from the clothing section, talking to someone about the quality of a sweater, discussing whether the color would match her daughter's school uniform. Elena followed the voice, her camera rolling, but found only empty racks swaying slightly as if someone had just brushed past them. The conversation continued. Now 2 voices, then 3, discussing prices and comparing products with the casual familiarity of regular shoppers who knew this store intimately. She could hear shopping carts rolling, the electronic beep of price scanners, and the rustle of plastic bags, but saw only empty aisles stretching into fluorescent infinity. The voices grew more numerous as Elena ventured deeper into the store, creating a symphony of retail interaction that should have been impossible in an abandoned building. Customers debating the merits of different breakfast cereals, employees offering help over the intercom, children asking their parents for toys. All of it happening around her but just out of sight, as if she was experiencing the ghost of every shopping trip that had ever taken place here. Elena tried to leave when the voices became overwhelming, but the entrance she'd used was no longer where she remembered it. The store had somehow rearranged itself, with aisles that stretched further than the building's actual dimensions and sections that led to other sections in impossible configurations. The grocery area flowed directly into electronics, which somehow connected to a garden center that couldn't possibly exist indoors, complete with the sound of sprinklers and the smell of mulch. She'd been walking for hours, though her phone insisted only 20 minutes had passed since she'd entered. The battery was draining faster than it should have, dropping from full charge to 30% while she watched. The voices around her became more insistent, customers asking for her help finding items, employees welcoming her to the store and asking if she had her discount card ready. Elena realized with growing dread that she was becoming part of the retail ecosystem, that the store was trying to assign her a role in its endless commerce cycle. A voice over the PA system announced a blue light special in aisle 7, but there was no aisle 7, or maybe there were 20 aisles 7, all existing simultaneously in different versions of the same store. She tried to film her exit, but every path led deeper into the maze of retail space that defied the laws of architecture and physics. The checkout lane stretched infinitely in both directions, with customers from different decades standing patiently in line. A woman in 1950s dressed with victory rolls in her hair, a teenager from the 1980s clutching a Walkman, a soccer mom from the 2000s with a cart full of organic groceries. They all turned to look at Elena with expectant smiles, as if she was the cashier they'd been waiting for, and she realized that everyone who entered this store eventually found their place in its eternal retail cycle. Some became customers, forever shopping for items they'd never quite find, while others became employees, forever serving customers who could never quite leave. Elena felt herself reaching for the blue vest that materialized on a nearby hook, felt the familiar weight of a name tag settling against her chest, heard herself asking the next customer in line if they'd found everything they were looking for today. Because some stores don't just close. They become shopping experiences that transcend time itself, where every purchase is both the first and the last transaction, and customer service truly means forever. Story 3. Derek Matheson hadn't planned on ever setting foot in the Billings, Montana Walmart again, especially not at midnight on the 2-year anniversary of what corporate euphemistically called the incident. But his ex-wife needed his security locker cleaned out for the divorce proceedings, and the building's new owners had given him exactly 24 hours before they started demolition. The store had been shuttered immediately after that Black Friday when 17 people were hospitalized and 3 died in what officials termed a mass hysteria event, though Derek knew better. He'd been working security that day, had seen things through those cameras that no official report would ever document. The employee entrance still recognized his keycard, which should have been impossible since the system had been deactivated for 2 years. But the lock clicked open with that familiar electronic chirp that sent a chill through his spine. The security office was exactly as he'd left it. Monitors dark, coffee mug still sitting on the desk with a ring of mold floating on top of whatever he'd been drinking that morning when everything went wrong. Derek flicked his flashlight around the small room, locating his locker in the corner, but when he tried the combination, the metal door reflected something in the overhead that made him spin around. The security monitors were on. All 16 screens glowed with that familiar blue-white light, displaying camera feeds from throughout the store, but that was impossible because the power had been cut months ago. Derek approached the monitors with the same sick fascination that had kept him glued to these screens 2 years ago, watching the feeds cycle through different areas of the store in their programmed rotation. The cameras showed empty aisles, just as he'd expected, but something was wrong with the timestamp in the corner of each screen. Instead of the current date, they displayed November 29, 2023, the day of the incident. More disturbing was the fact that the cameras seemed to be tracking movement he couldn't see, panning and zooming to follow invisible figures through the store with the smooth mechanical precision of automated surveillance. Derek had programmed these cameras himself, knew their movement patterns intimately, and they were definitely tracking something. He tried to switch to different camera angles, but the system wouldn't respond to his inputs, continuing its predetermined surveillance routine as if it was still that horrible Black Friday morning. That's when he noticed his own reflection in Monitor 7, except he wasn't standing where his reflection suggested he should be. The Derek on the screen was positioned near the electronics counter, wearing his security uniform from 2 years ago, and he was pointing at something off-camera with an expression of absolute terror on his face. Derek looked down at his current clothes, jeans and a hoodie, then back at the monitor where his uniformed reflection continued to point and mouth words he couldn't hear. He grabbed the radio from his old desk and keyed the mic out of habit, and his own voice crackled through the speakers. "Code Red, we have a situation in electronics, requesting immediate backup." It was his voice from 2 years ago, the exact words he'd spoken when he first noticed customers acting strangely, their movements becoming synchronized and predatory. The radio chatter continued, playing back his entire shift from that Black Friday in real time, but with additional transmissions he didn't remember making, conversations with other security personnel about things they'd observed but never officially reported. Derek heard himself describing customers who moved in perfect formation through the aisles, shoppers whose eyes reflected the fluorescent lights like nocturnal predators, and, worst of all, the moment when he realized the customers weren't shopping for merchandise, they were hunting other customers. The monitors began switching between current feeds and archived footage from the incident, creating a disorienting blend of past and present that made Derek's head spin. He watched himself from 2 years ago running through the store, trying to help people escape whatever was happening, while simultaneously seeing his current self standing in the security office watching these events unfold. The temporal loop was perfect and inescapable, with cause and effect bleeding into each other until he couldn't tell whether he was experiencing the past or creating the future. On Monitor 12, he saw customers from that Black Friday beginning to fill the aisles again, their movements jerky and unnatural like stop-motion animation, their faces bearing expressions of hunger that had nothing to do with shopping deals. They moved through the store in the same patterns they'd followed 2 years ago, but now Derek could see what the official investigation had missed. These weren't customers experiencing mass hysteria. They were something else entirely, something that had been waiting in the store for the right conditions to manifest. The radio crackled with more voices, security personnel and managers he'd worked with, all of them reporting the same impossible observations about customers who cast no shadows, whose breath didn't fog the refrigerated sections, who picked up merchandise with hands that passed through solid objects moments later. Derek realized the security system hadn't been recording random footage. It had been documenting an invasion, cataloging the methods and behaviors of entities that used Black Friday crowds as camouflage for something far more sinister than retail theft. The timestamp on the monitors began counting forward from that November day, showing Derek what had happened in the hours and days after the official closure, revealing that the store had never really emptied. The entities had remained, growing stronger in the absence of genuine human activity, feeding on the residual energy of commercial desire and consumer desperation that permeated every surface of the retail space. Derek tried to leave, but the door to the security office wouldn't open, and he realized with growing horror that he was watching himself become part of the archived footage. Monitor 9 showed him standing in the security office, staring at the screens with the same terrified expression he'd worn 2 years ago, trapped in a loop of observation that would play out forever. The radio in his hand crackled with his own voice from the future, reporting incidents that hadn't happened yet, but were already being recorded by cameras that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. He understood finally that the security system had never been documenting events. It had been creating them, using the psychological power of surveillance to manifest the very dangers it pretended to protect against. Derek's last coherent thought before the loop claimed him completely was the realization that some security systems don't just record crimes, they create criminals. And the most dangerous criminals are the ones who never existed until someone started watching for them. The monitors continued their eternal surveillance, adding Derek's entrapment to their archive of impossible events, proof that the best security measures are the ones that make sure no one ever really leaves. Story 4. Sarah Chen had worked with homeless populations for 8 years, but the reports coming from Shreveport, Louisiana, were unlike anything she'd encountered in her career as a social outreach coordinator. According to multiple police reports and concerned citizen calls, a thriving community of people had taken up residence in the Walmart that Hurricane Laura had gutted 3 years ago, but every time authorities investigated, they found nothing but empty ruins and water damage. The building had been condemned after the storm, its roof partially collapsed and its interior flooded with several feet of contaminated water that left everything moldy and uninhabitable. Yet witnesses insisted they'd seen people in blue vests directing traffic in the parking lot, organizing what appeared to be supply distributions, and maintaining regular business hours despite the obvious impossibility of the situation. Sarah decided to investigate personally after receiving a desperate call from Margaret Tran, whose homeless brother had mentioned finding work at the store that never closed, and hadn't been seen for 2 weeks. Sarah arrived at the abandoned Walmart on a humid Tuesday morning, the Louisiana sun already baking the cracked asphalt of the parking lot at 9 a.m. The building looked exactly as she'd expected. Hurricane damaged, partially collapsed, with yellow caution tape fluttering around the perimeter like prayer flags marking a disaster zone. But as she approached the main entrance, she noticed something that made her pause. Fresh tire tracks in the mud leading to the loading dock and what appeared to be recently swept concrete near the employee entrance. The smell hit her first when she managed to pry open a side door, not the expected odor of mold and decay, but the artificial pine scent of industrial cleaning supplies mixed with the distinctive smell of fresh coffee brewing. Sarah called out, identifying herself as a social worker, and was startled to hear a cheerful voice respond from somewhere in the darkened interior. "Welcome to Walmart." "We're currently experiencing some lighting issues, but our associates are here to help you find whatever you need." The voice had that practiced retail enthusiasm that every customer service employee eventually develops, but it echoed strangely in the cavernous space, as if coming from speakers that couldn't possibly be functional in a building without electricity. Sarah used her phone's flashlight to navigate the debris-strewn entrance, stepping carefully around chunks of ceiling tile and puddles of stagnant water. But as she moved deeper into the store, the damage seemed to recede. The aisles became cleaner, the shelves more organized, and she began to encounter people, dozens of them, all wearing blue Walmart vests and name tags, all busy with various tasks like stocking shelves, operating registers, and helping customers she couldn't see. They greeted her with genuine warmth, asking if she needed help finding anything specific, explaining that they were having a wonderful quarter despite the challenging economic conditions. When Sarah asked about the hurricane damage, they looked confused, insisting the store had never been in better condition and inviting her to speak with management about their employee satisfaction ratings. She tried to photograph the scene with her phone, but the camera showed only the damaged interior she'd expected to find: collapsed shelving, water stains, and debris scattered throughout the space. Yet her eyes continued to see a fully functional retail environment with employees who moved with purpose and pride, organizing merchandise and providing customer service with dedication that bordered on religious fervor. Sarah approached a woman whose name tag read Jennifer, 15 years of service, and asked about work schedules and living arrangements. But Jennifer seemed confused by the questions, explaining that associates lived in the break room apartments that corporate had provided and that they'd never been happier with their work-life balance. When Sarah asked to see these apartments, Jennifer led her through a door marked Employees Only into what should have been a small break room but instead opened onto a corridor lined with doors, each bearing the name of a different associate and decorated with personal touches that suggested long-term occupancy. The apartments were small but comfortable, furnished with beds, desks, and personal belongings, and Jennifer explained proudly that corporate had implemented this live-in program to ensure optimal customer service by eliminating commute times and allowing associates to focus entirely on their retail responsibilities. Sarah began to understand with growing dread that she wasn't encountering homeless people who had found shelter in an abandoned building. She was witnessing something far more sinister. These were people who had disappeared over the years, individuals whose absence hadn't been noticed or investigated because they belonged to populations society had already forgotten. They'd been recruited, absorbed, and transformed into permanent employees of a store that existed in a reality parallel to the physical world, where corporate policies had evolved beyond mere profit maximization into something approaching human resource management on a cosmic scale. The associates showed no signs of distress or coercion. They genuinely loved their work, spoke glowingly of their managers, and seemed fulfilled by their roles in ways that actual retail employees rarely experienced. But when Sarah tried to leave, she found that the exit doors had been replaced by additional departments: a pharmacy staffed by people who'd once lived on the streets, an auto service center run by individuals who'd been reported missing months ago, and a grocery section managed by men and women whose faces appeared on outdated missing person flyers that no one had bothered to update. Jennifer noticed Sarah's distress and kindly offered her an application, explaining that they were always hiring motivated individuals who wanted to be part of a retail family that truly cared about both its associates and its customers. The paperwork materialized in Jennifer's hands, along with a blue vest in Sarah's exact size and a name tag that already bore her name with the cheerful addendum, "New Team Member." Sarah realized that this wasn't just a place where homeless people had found shelter. It was a recruitment center disguised as customer service, where society's forgotten individuals were offered the ultimate employee benefits package: purpose, community, and the guarantee that they'd never be homeless or unemployed again. Because some jobs don't just provide security, they provide eternal employment, and the best employee retention programs are the ones where quitting simply isn't an option. Sarah felt the vest settling around her shoulders as Jennifer pinned the name tag to her chest, welcoming her to a team that would never let her go, where customer service truly meant serving customers forever, and employee loyalty was more than just a performance metric. It was a binding spiritual contract that lasted beyond death, beyond memory, and beyond any reality that the outside world would ever be willing to acknowledge or investigate. Story 5. Jake Morrell had demolished 17 buildings in his 20-year career, but the Walmart in Grand Rapids, Michigan was the first job that 3 separate crews had walked away from without explanation, leaving behind expensive equipment and refusing to return phone calls. The building had been scheduled for demolition 6 months ago to make way for a new shopping complex, but every time crews showed up to begin work, they encountered what the previous foreman's report vaguely described as structural anomalies that require further investigation. Jake's company, Apex Demolition, had won the contract by bidding 40% lower than their competitors, confident that whatever had spooked the other crews was probably just foundation issues or asbestos concerns that proper safety protocols could handle. What Jake discovered when he arrived at 6 a.m. on a cold October morning was a building that seemed to resist documentation. His initial walkthrough photos came out blurred despite perfect lighting conditions. His measurements didn't match the architectural plans, and his crew's laser levels kept malfunctioning in ways that suggested the building's geometry was somehow inconsistent. The Walmart had been closed for 2 years after a mysterious decline in customer traffic that corporate couldn't explain, with shoppers reporting that they felt uncomfortable in the store without being able to specify why. Jake's first indication that this wasn't a standard demolition job came when he tried to map the interior layout for strategic demolition points, only to discover that the building contained significantly more space than its external dimensions could accommodate. The main sales floor stretched further than his measuring tape could reach. Aisles extended in directions that shouldn't exist according to the floor plan, and doorways led to rooms that weren't shown in any of the architectural documentation. When Jake's crew arrived, they immediately noticed that their footsteps echoed differently in various sections of the store, as if some areas had cathedral-high ceilings while others felt compressed and claustrophobic, despite appearing identical in height when measured with standard equipment. The demolition work began in the northwest corner, where Jake's team used sledgehammers to break through drywall, expecting to find typical retail construction: metal studs, insulation, and utilities. Instead, they discovered that the walls seemed to rebuild themselves overnight, with holes they'd created mysteriously filling in with materials that matched the original construction so perfectly that Jake began questioning his crew's work reports. Surveillance cameras they'd installed to monitor the site overnight showed footage of empty rooms, but the audio tracks captured sounds of construction activity: hammering, drilling, and the electric whine of power tools working through the night with mechanical precision that no human crew could maintain. Jake reviewed the footage frame by frame, but never saw workers, only the evidence of their labor appearing between camera sweeps as if invisible hands were repairing damage faster than his crew could create it. The building's resistance to demolition became more aggressive as work progressed, with walls that developed stress cracks in response to sledgehammer blows, but redistributed those cracks in patterns that actually strengthened the structure rather than weakening it. Jake's industrial equipment began malfunctioning in coordinated ways that suggested intentional sabotage: hydraulic systems losing pressure simultaneously, electrical tools shorting out in sequence, and concrete saws binding on materials that should have cut easily. The most disturbing development was the discovery that rooms they'd already gutted were somehow restoring themselves with inventory that had never been removed, as if the building was regenerating its commercial identity from some internal template that existed independent of physical destruction. Jake found himself standing in electronic sections filled with televisions displaying static, pharmacy areas stocked with medications that had expiration dates decades in the future, and grocery aisles lined with products in packaging he'd never seen before, all in spaces his crew had supposedly stripped to the studs the previous day. The building seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously: demolished and intact, empty and fully stocked, abandoned and actively operating, with Jake's perception shifting between realities depending on his location within the structure and his mental focus on specific aspects of what he was observing. His crew members began reporting similar experiences, describing work areas that changed configuration when they weren't looking directly at them, tools that moved to different locations overnight despite being locked in secure containers, and the persistent sensation of being watched by customers who were shopping in a store that existed parallel to the demolished space they were working in. Jake realized that the previous demolition crews hadn't abandoned the project due to safety concerns or equipment failures. They'd fled because the building was actively defending itself using methods that violated the fundamental assumptions of construction and physics that their entire profession was built upon. The Walmart wasn't just a retail space that had been abandoned. It was a commercial entity that had achieved a form of architectural consciousness, maintaining its identity and function through sheer force of consumer will accumulated over decades of shopping experiences. Jake's final day on the job began with the discovery that his crew's demolition work had somehow created new rooms rather than eliminating existing ones, expanding the building's interior footprint while leaving the external structure apparently unchanged. He stood in a vast atrium that definitely hadn't existed the day before, surrounded by balconies and escalators leading to additional shopping levels that stretched upward beyond his flashlight's reach, all filled with the sound of invisible shoppers and the electronic harmony of a retail space in full operation. Jake understood finally that some buildings don't just house commercial activity. They become commercial activity, transforming from mere containers of consumer culture into living embodiments of the shopping experience itself. The demolition contract had never been about destroying a building. It had been about feeding the structure's growth with the energy of attempted destruction, allowing it to expand and evolve into something that transcended the physical limitations of architecture and entered the realm of pure commercial consciousness. Jake felt his hard hat being replaced by a blue vest, felt his clipboard transforming into a name tag that identified him as Assistant Manager, Demolition and Renovation, and realized he'd become part of the building's staff, forever tasked with managing the expansion projects that would allow the store to grow larger and more complex with each failed attempt to destroy it. Because some retail spaces don't just survive demolition, they use it as a renovation method, and the most successful businesses are the ones that turn every threat into an opportunity for expansion. Story 6. Amanda Foster had covered plenty of anniversary stories during her 15 years as an investigative journalist, but the annual phenomenon at the Pine Bluff, Arkansas Walmart was something that local authorities preferred to ignore rather than explain. Every Black Friday since the store's closure in 2019, emergency services received dozens of calls about crowds gathering in the abandoned parking lot, shoppers lined up outside the sealed entrance, and the sound of what witnesses described as the worst stampede you've ever heard, coming from inside the empty building. The official reports always concluded that concerned citizens had mistaken shadows, wind, or settling noises for human activity, but Amanda had interviewed enough witnesses to know that mass hallucinations don't follow such precise annual schedules or produce such consistent details across unrelated accounts. The Walmart had been shuttered permanently after a Black Friday stampede that killed 4 people and injured 37 others in a frenzy over doorbuster deals that, according to survivors, had seemed to trigger something primal and predatory in the crowd's behavior that went far beyond normal shopping enthusiasm. Amanda arrived at the abandoned store at 11 p.m. on Black Friday, exactly 5 years after the tragedy, equipped with recording equipment and a photographer who specialized in paranormal documentation. The parking lot was empty except for debris scattered by autumn wind, but Amanda immediately noticed that the asphalt bore fresh scuff marks in patterns that suggested heavy foot traffic, as if hundreds of people had recently walked the same paths that shoppers had followed during the store's operational years. The building itself looked appropriately abandoned, windows boarded up, entrance doors chained shut, and official notices warning against trespassing. But Amanda could swear she heard the distant sound of crowd noise coming from somewhere inside, the low murmur of hundreds of voices engaged in the competitive conversations that characterized pre-opening lineup excitement. At exactly midnight, the parking lot began to fill with shadows that moved with purpose and intent, organizing themselves into the same queue formation that Black Friday shoppers had used when the store was operational. But these figures cast no reflection in the puddles scattered across the asphalt and made no sound despite their obvious movement and interaction. Amanda tried to photograph them, but her camera captured only empty parking lot, while her audio equipment recorded the unmistakable sounds of crowd formation, conversations about sale items, complaints about wait times, and the shuffling footsteps of people maintaining their positions in line for hours. The phantom crowd grew denser as the night progressed, with Amanda finding herself surrounded by invisible shoppers who bumped against her, stepped on her feet, and pushed past her with the aggressive urgency that characterized Black Friday crowds but left no physical evidence of their presence beyond the increasingly claustrophobic sensation of being trapped in a dense mass of bodies that existed just beyond the threshold of visibility. At 3 a.m., the sounds from inside the building began. First, the electronic chiming of registers opening, then the mechanical voices of the PA system announcing store hours and special deals, followed by the thunderous sound of the entrance doors being opened and the crowd surging forward with devastating force. Amanda was swept along with the invisible stampede, her feet lifting off the ground as the phantom crowd carried her toward the building's sealed entrance, which somehow opened before her despite the chains and boards that should have prevented entry. Inside the abandoned Walmart, Amanda found herself in the middle of the deadliest shopping event she'd ever witnessed, surrounded by hundreds of people whose faces were frozen in expressions of desperate acquisition, their eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights like the eyes of animals in hunting mode, their movements coordinated with predatory precision as they competed for merchandise that flickered between existence and void. The shoppers moved in patterns that defied human behavior, flowing through aisles with the efficiency of swarming insects, their arms reaching for products that materialized and vanished based on the intensity of their desire, creating a feedback loop of consumer hunger that fed on itself and grew stronger with each transaction. Amanda realized she was witnessing not just the anniversary of a tragedy, but the eternal repetition of it, as the dead shoppers from that original Black Friday continued their hunt for deals that could never satisfy the commercial hunger that had consumed them in life and now defined their existence in death. The stampede never ended in this version of reality. It just reset and repeated with each new participant who got caught in the crowd's momentum, adding their consumer desire to the collective hunting instinct that drove the phantom shoppers through their endless Black Friday loop. Amanda tried to escape, but found that the crowd's movement patterns were designed to trap newcomers, drawing them toward the center of the store where the original stampede had reached its deadly climax, a spot now marked by shelving units that bled merchandise when touched and registers that processed sales in currencies of pain and desperation. The phantom shoppers turned their attention to Amanda, recognizing her as fresh prey for their eternal shopping expedition, their faces shifting between their death expressions and eager customer service smiles as they explained the deals she simply couldn't afford to miss, bargains that required payment in memories, discounts that could only be claimed by surrendering her connection to the living world, and a special Black Friday promotion that offered permanent membership in their shopping community at the low cost of never leaving the store again. Amanda felt herself reaching for products that existed only as manifestations of pure consumer desire, felt the familiar thrill of competition for limited-time offers, and realized that the Black Friday stampede had never ended. It had just become a permanent shopping experience that recruited new participants every year, growing stronger with each addition to its customer base. She joined the crowd's eternal hunt for deals that would always be just out of reach, becoming another voice in the annual phenomenon that local authorities preferred to dismiss as mass hysteria rather than acknowledge as the commercial ghost story that it truly was. Because some shopping events don't end when the stores close. They become traditions that transcend death itself, and the best Black Friday deals are the ones that last forever, paid for with everything customers have to give. Story 7. Robert Garrison had spent 32 years climbing the corporate ladder at Walmart, from cart pusher to district manager, but he'd never heard of store number 0001 until the day he received the cryptic email marked Executive Priority Investigation, with coordinates for a location in rural Kansas that didn't appear on any official company maps. The message, sent from an internal address he didn't recognize, explained that corporate headquarters needed him to conduct a routine operational assessment of what they termed a legacy prototype facility that had been temporarily removed from active oversight due to administrative restructuring. Robert had handled plenty of unusual assignments during his career: stores with persistent theft problems, locations with employee retention issues, facilities dealing with community relations disasters, but the corporate language in this directive was more evasive than usual, filled with euphemisms that suggested something beyond typical retail challenges. The drive to the coordinates took him through increasingly desolate farmland, past abandoned grain silos and farmhouses that looked like they'd been empty for decades, until he reached a Walmart that appeared identical to modern supercenters, except for subtle details that felt wrong in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The building's proportions seemed slightly off, as if designed by someone who had heard detailed descriptions of Walmart stores but never actually visited one, and the parking lot was filled with vehicles from different eras: 1970s sedans parked next to 1990s minivans and cars from decades Robert couldn't identify, all arranged in perfect rows despite the apparent impossibility of such diverse automotive attendants. Robert used his master key to enter through the management office, but found himself in a reception area that extended upward for what appeared to be dozens of floors, with escalators and elevators leading to executive levels that shouldn't exist in a single-story retail building, each floor marked with department names he'd never encountered in company literature: Consumer Desire Analytics, Temporal Purchasing Coordination, and Infinite Inventory Management. The store directory listed management positions that made no sense within normal corporate structure: Vice President of Existential Customer Relations, Director of Metaphysical Loss Prevention, and Regional Manager of Dimensional Retail Expansion. But each office was occupied by executives in business attire who greeted Robert with the professional courtesy of colleagues who'd been expecting his visit. Robert attempted to conduct his routine assessment, but quickly discovered that normal retail metrics didn't apply to store number 0001, which apparently served customers from multiple time periods simultaneously, maintained inventory that existed in quantum superposition until observed by potential purchasers, and operated on fiscal quarters that lasted anywhere from 3 months to several years depending on complex variables that the temporal purchasing coordinator tried to explain using charts that hurt Robert's eyes to look at directly. The customer demographics were equally impossible to categorize. Shoppers included people wearing clothing from different historical periods, families who spoke languages that sounded almost familiar but not quite identifiable, and individuals whose movements and behaviors suggested they might not be entirely human despite appearing normal from a distance. Robert's attempts to review sales figures and operational reports led him deeper into the building's management structure, where he discovered that store number 0001 served as corporate headquarters for retail operations that extended far beyond Earth's commercial markets, with departments dedicated to managing shopping experiences across dimensions, time periods, and states of reality that normal business administration had never been designed to handle. The executives he met were universally helpful and professional, eager to show Robert their impressive operational efficiency and customer satisfaction ratings, but their explanations of company policy involved concepts that violated everything he'd learned about retail management during his 3-decade career with the corporation. The Vice President of Existential Customer Relations explained that store number 0001's primary function was to serve as a testing ground for retail concepts that transcended traditional limitations of space, time, and customer mortality, allowing the company to explore shopping experiences that could continue indefinitely regardless of normal human limitations like death, aging, or economic capacity. Robert learned that every Walmart store was connected to store number 0001 through a management structure that operated according to corporate policies designed to optimize not just profit, but the fundamental nature of commercial reality itself, transforming shopping from a simple transaction into a spiritual experience that could reshape consciousness and reality on a cosmic scale. The director of metaphysical loss prevention showed Robert security footage of shoplifting incidents that involved customers stealing abstract concepts, emotions, and memories rather than physical merchandise, explaining that store number 0001's inventory included items that existed as pure consumer desire rather than tangible products, requiring security measures that operated on psychological and spiritual levels. Robert realized with growing horror that his entire career had been preparation for this moment. Not just his professional advancement through corporate ranks, but his personal development into someone capable of understanding and managing retail operations that existed beyond normal human comprehension, transforming him into a corporate executive for business activities that spanned multiple realities and served customers who weren't necessarily alive in any conventional sense. The regional manager of Dimensional Retail Expansion offered Robert a promotion to vice president of Infinite Customer Service, explaining that his experience managing earthbound retail operations had qualified him for responsibilities that would involve overseeing shopping experiences across all possible versions of reality, ensuring that customer satisfaction remained optimal regardless of which dimension, time period, or state of existence shoppers happened to be experiencing. Robert felt his business suit transforming into something that looked similar, but was constructed from materials that existed in more dimensions than normal fabric could accommodate. Felt his corporate identification badge updating with new titles and clearance levels that granted him access to management responsibilities beyond anything he'd imagined during his climb up the company ladder. He accepted the promotion with the same professional enthusiasm that had driven his entire career, understanding finally that some corporate ladders don't just lead to higher positions within the company, they lead to positions that transcend the normal limitations of employment, reality, and existence itself. Because the most successful retail operations are the ones that recognize no boundaries whatsoever, and the best managers are the ones who can oversee customer service across infinite realities, ensuring that every possible version of every possible customer receives exactly the shopping experience they deserve, forever and ever, world without end, customer satisfaction guaranteed.